So, but she did it with grace and she did it with authority, and she's an amazing person. So let me read my formal introduction. For over 4 decades as a member of the OAH, Alice Kessler-Harris, the R. Gordon Hopsey Professor of American History at Columbia University, has graced the profession with her integrity, intellectual passion, and a commitment to expand the reach of historical knowledge beyond the boundaries of traditional scholarship. She is a pioneer in the study of women, gender, work, and social policy, and her books form a corpus of foundational work in the field. Her many books, notably Out to Work, A History of Wage-Earning Women in the United States, 1982, A Women's Wage, Historical Meanings and Social Consequences, 1990, and In Pursuit of Equity, Women, Men, and the Quest for Economic Citizenship in 20th Century America, published in 2001, have garnered high praise and multiple awards. Her most recent book, Gendering Labor History, published in 2007, is a collection of essays that reflect the remarkable career of one of the foremost scholars of gender and labor in the United States for more than a generation. In addition to a prolific publication record, Kessler-Harris has shown a commitment to the OAH few in her cohort can claim. Since the early 1980s, she has served the organization in many different capacities. As a member of the Journal of American History Editorial Board, Executive Board, the Strategic Planning Committee, in addition to other committee posts. Her service to the American Historical Association and the American Studies Association is equally impressive. This past year, as president of the OAH, her leadership of the organization was inspired by her characteristic devotion to equity and fairness in interactions among her peers, and to a deep commitment to the OAH as a community of American historians striving to become ever more inclusive, both intellectually and demographically. As members of the OAH, we are indeed fortunate that Alice Kessler-Harris has honored us by serving as president, a colleague who embodies the best of American historical practice and professional conduct. Please welcome our president, Alice Kessler-Harris.
Elected president and having served as president with so many good and wonderful people. It's been a wonderful year, and I know it isn't over yet because there's the executive board to serve with, but it has been just an enormous and satisfying experience. So for that, I thank you all. I also want to begin this talk by thanking some other people by name. First, our co-sponsors of this conference, I suppose, the NCPH, President Marty Blatt, co-program chair Kathleen Franzi, and the co-local arrangements committee leader Jasmine Allender. They've been wonderful in working with us to make this convention a success, and I don't want their contributions to go unmentioned before all of us, so perhaps we can give them a round of applause. But I want to call special attention as well to the two co-chairs of our local arrangements committee, and I haven't actually seen them all convention, so I don't know if they've been too busy to put in an appearance. But Steve Meyer and Margot Anderson, are you here? No, invisible. Well, they can have a round of applause anyway. And finally, a note of very special thanks to Nancy McLean. Nancy, where are you? I think we all agree that this is one of the most exciting programs that the OAH has had, that we love being in Milwaukee, and we love the program that has so many sessions that speak to our contemporary concerns. And for that, I think Nancy has to be doubly thanked. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to talk to you about a subject that's been on my mind for a long time. The theme of this conference, Capitalism and Democracy, Frontiers of Capitalism and Democracy, was a theme that emerged not entirely accidentally, but among other reasons. I had thought a long time ago that we really should be meeting about democracy. And one day at another OAH convention 2 years ago, I ran into Nelson Lichtenstein, who said to me, "No, it's not about democracy, it's about capitalism and democracy." So I thought I would talk to you about why it was that capitalism and democracy was so important. And I thought I would do it by picking up, if you like, with some of the themes in the book that's about to come out 2 days from now on Lillian Helman. Lillian Helman, the book is downstairs, just in case you want to pitch, in the exhibit hall.
It's sold out.
It's sold out?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Why didn't they bring more copies? The author's complaint. Let me begin then with Lillian Helman's grandmother, Sophie Marks Newhouse. She was then a widow who had raised 4 children, was asked by the census taker to describe her occupation. Her one-word answer appears in the 1900 census records for the city of New Orleans. She was, she told the census taker, a capitalist. We imagine the word pronounced proudly, for at the time, and most especially for a woman, that must have seemed an unusually ambitious self-description. A generation later, her granddaughter Lillian, who became a famous playwright, decried capitalists in one of the theater's most familiar lines as people who eat the earth and eat all the people on it, like in the Bible with the locusts. She was, we now know, describing her grandmother's family. Into the mouth of Addie, the black servant who condemned the locusts who ate the earth, Helman inserted the whispered sentence, "Sometimes I think it ain't right to watch them do it." The difference between Lillian Helman and her grandmother, Helman was born in 1905, provides a microscopic view into one of the dynamic tensions of 20th century America. Sophie Newhouse cared about the accumulation of wealth and lived the ostentatious life that demonstrated her success. For her, that was all there was. Lillian Helman, though she was quite comfortable with wealth, sought to restrain its influence, to live by a different code of values. These she described loosely as deep social ideals of the kind held by people with an uncommon sense of social responsibility. Helman's sharply articulated formulation of the conflict between people who eat the earth and those who stand by and watch leads me to reflect on what the 20th century owes to the continuous conflict, not between capitalism and communism, which which is how we usually think of the century, but rather between capitalism and democracy. Helman serves another purpose as well. She helps us to reclaim biography as a historian's art. You might be a bit suspicious of this, and I wouldn't be the first historian to identify so much with her subject, so that I could see the world only through her eyes. But luckily for you, and for me too, Lillian Helman, famous American playwright and memoirist, though she was, or became, was a pretty nasty piece of work. She was arrogant, mean-spirited, often vituperative, and frequently angry. She's a hard person to identify with. And yet, from her, and often against the grain, I've learned to think about the 20th century in new ways. Helman was a rebel, not a revolutionary. She believed in private property and in the rights of people, herself included, to fairly and responsibly acquire as much property as they could. She objected to power concentrated in money, to its acquisition through corruption and the exploitation of workers, to its misuse in the political process. She believed in both capitalism and democracy. And though she often bungled her politics, how she handled the tension between them illuminates a process of change that has defined the 20th century moment. Our meeting this year speaks directly to these questions. We planned this conference long before Occupy Wall Street and the spiraling Occupy movement raised the issue of equality to public consciousness. And yet, these events eerily affirm the historical arc. Our meeting in Milwaukee pinpoints the dramatic century-long evolution of American belief that has taken us full circle from the gospel of wealth to what one might call the gospel of inequality. We did not know when we agreed to meet in Milwaukee just how appropriate this city, which cherishes its socialist past and still nurtures the public interest, would be. Indeed, I have to say that as things unfolded, we began to feel lucky that we were meeting in Milwaukee. We identified our theme, the frontiers of capitalism and democracy, long before Wisconsin public employees marched on the State House to protest restrictions on their collective bargaining rights and to defend their union contracts. It may be too early to draw any conclusions about what this all means, but it's not too soon to ask how these events will reshape our questions. Events in Wisconsin evoke earlier definitions of the relationship of democracy to equality, on which historians might draw. If participants in the Wisconsin demonstrations and those in the Occupy movement imagine themselves as part of a struggle for democracy, their protests are grounded in claims to equality that harken back to the 19th century. As they march, participants invoke an expansive idea of democracy that relies on the ability of ordinary folk to exercise voice, through the ballot box to be sure, but also through trade unions, through their communities, and through the use of public space. The banners that call for recognition suggest a protean view of equality, measured by the loss of economic security and rising gaps between the incomes of the richest and the poorest. Rising levels of inequality, they argue, inhibit the exercise of democratic participation. Many express their helplessness against the power of money, which, as political philosopher Michael Walzer has suggested, carries with it the control not only of things, but of people too. The cry of the 99% calls attention to the distortions money imposes on the political realm. protesting the power and influence of the wealthiest members of society, demonstrators specifically deride the notion that their collective lack of economic resources leaves them content to cede power to an oligarchy of wealth. And yet, those protests fly in the face of what has in the past 30 years become the common wisdom, namely, that free market capitalism is not only the engine of prosperity, but the vehicle that permits the fairest distribution of economic resources and political power. Democracy and capitalism, we are taught to believe, go hand in hand. Public confidence in unregulated free markets has never been higher. Commitment to individual entrepreneurial freedom never stronger, and growing anti-government rhetoric never louder. Harkening back to 19th century notions of liberalism, individual liberty has become a widespread aspiration, its limits defined by those with property. In a world where the capacity to accumulate private wealth is perceived as the measure of national prosperity for all, tempting incentives to accumulate and to spend are built into our tax codes, our laws, our thought processes. And yet all around us, we witness signs of the perverse influence of money over democracy. Most recently, I don't have to repeat this to this group, but the Supreme Court's controversial decision in the case of Citizens United is the most, it's not the most recent, but it's the one that's caused the most controversy. But signs that democracy is in trouble appear as well in continuing efforts to deprive citizens of voice by incarceration, by curbing trade unions, by the increasing concentration and control of the media, as well as by explicit assaults on the right to vote. Democracy, in other words, is in trouble. We are, as historians, compelled to ask what's going on here. After a century of growing commitment to an expanded democracy, to increased participation, are we now witnessing its demise? Or is this one of the many iterations of the long struggle between freedom and equality, between capitalism and democracy, that has characterized so much of the American past? Why, to paraphrase Eric Hobsbawm, has the forward march of social reform halted? What can the current moment teach us about the continuing tension between capitalism and democracy? There is, of course, nothing new about the notion that democracy is grounded in an egalitarian belief system, or that the excessive acquisition of wealth threatens to undermine democratic rights. The ancient Greeks who defined, I know you didn't expect me to go back to the ancient, but I throw you a curveball. The ancient Greeks who defined their polity narrowly, excluding women and slaves and many others, nevertheless imagined their democracy as a form of government where free men and the poor, being in the majority, were invested with the power of the state. An egalitarian ethos underlines shared participation in their restricted polity, alerting them to the threat that excessive wealth posed. The accumulation of wealth, they thought, was the greatest enemy of democracy, for it would tend to amass power in the hands of the few. The inverse could also be true. Enlightenment philosophers who venerated private property and attached liberty to its possession worried that widely distributed political power would threaten that right. Unsurprisingly, as Raymond Williams points out, democracy was, until the late 18th century, a strongly unfavorable term. These tensions were apparent in the early years of the American Republic, when equality had many meanings and the distribution of wealth was a much discussed issue. Sean Wilentz notes that historians have overlooked what he describes as the once prevalent commitment to economic equality that lasted for a century after the Revolution. In a carefully reasoned article, Wilentz notes not only the assumption that the availability of land would enable a relative equality of wealth, but that in the imagination of the founding generation, such equality was essential to the health of the Republic. He quotes John Adams in 1776, "The balance of power in a society accompanies the balance of property in land." And again, Noah Webster in 1787, "A general and tolerably equal distribution of land and property is the whole basis of national freedom, the very soul of the Republic." James Madison participated in this chorus of voices, noting in the Federalist Papers that the great body of the people must take on in themselves or through their representatives the power to regulate the acquisition and distribution of wealth. Madison's comments came at a time when he might have been much less concerned with wealth distribution than we are today. In his day, as nearly as we can determine, the richest 1% of the population held only about 12% of the nation's wealth. Slavery challenged these notions of distribution in several ways. As the economic historian James Houston explains, in the moral economy of the early 19th century, Northerners understood slaveholders as an aristocracy that accumulated wealth in the form of human property as opposed to land. But since enslaved people constituted both wealth and labor, they posed a dilemma. Federalists and Republicans alike in those early years agreed that workers were entitled to the wealth they produced, their fair compensation contributing to the reasonable distribution of wealth and to containing and restraining an aristocratic class. Slaveholders necessarily disagreed, insisting on their right to retain the wealth produced by enslaved people. Abolitionists took on this issue with a vengeance, arguing that slaveholders stole the labor of their slaves, producing thereby the kind of aristocracy that was anathema to the new republic. The emergence of industrial capital in the 19th century challenged these egalitarian conceptions, positing instead the notion of liberty as a necessary incentive to accumulate the property that would in turn lead to national prosperity. This narrow definition of liberty, like equality, though liberty had many other meanings as well, this narrow definition, it was in common usage in the decades before the Civil War. And this common usage assigned to liberty the freedom of individuals to make use of their property free of government intervention, but not, as it turned out, free of government support. This conflict in belief systems between the egalitarians and those who believed in liberty drew on spreading ideas that we now identify as classical liberalism. The well-being of a population could be guaranteed only by continuing economic growth, whose most efficient engine was capitalism. To assure prosperity, governments coddled entrepreneurs, encouraging them to invest in manufactures, commerce, and trade by protecting property and by expanding rewards. The result was a rapid expansion in the concentration of wealth until by 1860, the top 1% held 29% of all the wealth in the nation, more than doubling, 2.5 times that held during the revolutionary period. Inequality would be mitigated, so went the new belief system, by expanding prosperity for all. Political scientist Dana Villa succinctly identifies the resulting conflict as the fundamental tension between capitalism and democracy, namely, how to care for the public realm in a world where people's primary energies are devoted to the pursuit of private interest. Even in the heady days of early industrial capitalism, some noted the threat posed to democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville, and no talk to this group would be complete without citing de Tocqueville, so I had to find a way to throw him in. De Tocqueville called attention to the growth of what he called a manufacturing aristocracy that he described as one of the hardest that ever appeared on earth. The friends of democracy, he warned, should keep their eyes anxiously fixed in that direction. The producing classes attacked the moneyed interests with little love for each other. Wage workers believed that they would have to wrest money and power from men of wealth. And in their turn, the wealthy feared the anarchy and disorder latent in discontented groups who sought to achieve both freedom and to the polity. Who sought access to both freedom and to the polity. The tensions that exploded in the late 19th century are well known to all of us. The rise of the robber barons, frequent economic crises, the great strikes that repeatedly descended into violence, instigated usually by private and public militias, the sad social disorder as families fell into poverty, were forced into peonage, or fought with incoming immigrants for scarce jobs. Demands for government intervention took center stage as utopian, socialist, syndicalist, populist, and sometimes even anarchist ideas appealed to ever larger sections of the industrial working classes. It mattered little whether businessmen or financiers controlled the economy, the political consequences were the same. The big problem was how control over financial and over finances and the credit system was to be extended to citizens at large. This, thought Walter Lippmann in the early 20th century, is one of the subtlest problems of democracy. It fell to the early 20th century progressive movement to address the conflict head-on and to begin what became the 20th century project of adjusting capitalism to the demands of democracy. The new liberalism, our definition of liberalism, dates from this period. Spearheaded by socialists like Florence Kelly, muckrakers like Ida Tarbell, and politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, and informed by social scientists, economists, and reformers, liberals sought to convince the business classes that to maximize their access to profits, they would need a peaceful and cooperative public realm. Towards that end, they called on governments to intervene in the marketplace to remove some of the barriers to equality and at the same time to restore a balance of power that had tilted government authority too heavily in the direction of great wealth. Lillian Helman, reading Chekhov, would later approvingly describe the reform impulse that led to change in this period, noting that advocates of early 20th century change were in the deepest sense reformers. She remarked that human life was of very great importance to them. They wished to reform, she wrote, not from busybody zeal, but from their anguish that the individual human beings cease to suffer hunger and disease. In the view of this American brand of liberalism, capitalism could not survive without the support and cooperation of those who served it. Only the opportunity for significant social and economic mobility, the creation of what some called economic democracy, would assure that support. To gain it, capitalism would have to restrain its imperative to make ever larger profits for the few. The forces of democracy, in turn, would be asked to acknowledge the rights of property, to agree to protect the liberty to accumulate wealth. In this practical arrangement, the new administrative state would become both arbiter and enforcer. Labor unions might have a place, and yet their demands for a voice in the workplace would remain contested. Regulating capitalism, nevertheless, would ensure its survival, facilitating the democratic impulse through expanded notions of equality would empower a public voice. While preserving the liberty to maintain property, it was thought, American capitalism could provide the jobs and the opportunities that would increase the quality of life for the many. And this increase in the quality of life would in turn expand democratic participation and voice. It sounded like a wonderful arrangement. Capitalism could do good for the many, even as it enriched the few. Such was the belief system that emerged in the early 20th century and gained traction as the century progressed. Some of my earlier work on social policy illustrates the implementation of this 20th century notion of liberalism, and especially the institutionalization of a belief system that sustained capitalist enterprise, even as it deployed traditional understandings of the family, hierarchical understandings of race and of class to regulate the distribution of its benefits. This was the decade, 20s into the 30s in Europe as well as in the United States, when notions of citizenship expanded to include what British social thinker T.H. Marshall identified as social citizenship, and remarked as the culmination of the war between 20th century citizenship and the capitalist citizenship, the ideal that social citizenship could be achieved for all. In Marshall's view, the move towards a more inclusive political democracy required that each individual have access to at least a minimum of economic security, a guarantee of a minimum income for children, for families, for the poor and the ill, and a commitment to equality of opportunity attained through education. This would be the ground on which capitalism could continue to function. Access to social citizenship and emerging consensus agreed provided the necessary basis for political rights. Without social citizenship, the voices of the excluded would be drowned and democracy would become a mere chimera. Aware of the costs to capitalism, in the 1930s, people noted that achieving social citizenship would require no mindless sacrifice of liberty. Rather, each individual would be asked to exercise a lively sense of responsibility towards the welfare of the community. Again, the compromise. Unsurprisingly, Lillian Helman provides an example of the rebellious spirit that encouraged many of her generation to seek to participate in expanding democratic turf. And I'm sure there are 100 examples in your heads out there, but Lillian's in mine. Born in 1905, she grew to maturity in the 1920s, the decade of raging capitalism that witnessed yet another huge increase in the wealth owned by the top 1% of the population, this time up to 36%. You notice the decline. She took full advantage of the new freedoms granted to women working, drinking, and partying on the edge of a world of writers in the 20s and into the early 30s. Still in her mid-20s, when the 30s began, she watched mostly from the sidelines as the economic crisis of capitalism worsened, tensions grew, and demands for greater economic security and social mobility escalated. As the decade unfolded, Helman, already a successful playwright, placed herself firmly on the side of expanding democracy, which she understood in Marshall's terms. Despite, perhaps because of, the wealth represented by one side of her family, she advocated for an egalitarian agenda that resonated with a larger public and that set the stage for the consensus that would follow. She was completely in tune with the New Deal, policymakers who managed in modest ways to curtail economic freedom in order to achieve some form of social citizenship were, in many instances, her ideal. To be sure, the American model of social policy contained harsh gendered and racial exclusions, but it reflected as well an expansion of the spirit of egalitarian democracy that animated the progressive moment. Whatever its successes or failures, it represented a struggle to curtail the freewheeling capitalism of the 20s in favor of a belief system that reverted to a more egalitarian spirit and more egalitarian goals. FDR captured this shift in his second inaugural address. The test of progress, he proclaimed, is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Crucially, trade unions became a voice of democracy, taking their places as vehicles for exercising voice for working people. They were written into the egalitarian agenda when a new National Labor Relations Board designed to monitor collective bargaining legitimized their positions. Helman re-enters our story here. Though she'd been deeply involved in forming and working for two unions, the Screenwriters Guild and the Dramatists Guild, before the Wagner Act, it was only after that act passed that the Screenwriters Guild earned the right to represent that craft. The same year that the Screenwriters Guild, with Helman on the steering committee, negotiated its first contract, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act with its expansive provisions to establish minimum wages and maximum hours for men and women, and to curtail sweatshop and child labor. Here was social citizenship moving forward. To be sure, the New Deal evidenced a far stronger commitment to the liberty of the marketplace than counterpart European programs did. Compared to the emerging social democratic programs of Western Europe and the Nordic countries, the US paid little attention to income redistribution or to eliminating poverty and reducing class differences. But by refusing to give corporate capitalism a larger voice in state affairs, as the fascist countries did, and by eschewing the extremes of communism that expropriated all private property, as the socialist republics did, the US maintained a stalwart commitment to liberty, even as it bent towards a more egalitarian citizenry. This was perhaps the moment when democracy and capitalism joined together in an ideal of liberal democracy, and perhaps the moment when the two together offered significant hope for a successful partnership. Theoretically, at least, such a fusion would guarantee human freedom and foster economic equality, their joint and mutually constitutive relationship seemingly taken for granted as natural. Empowering the poor, however, had the perverse effect of fostering demands for increased democratic participation. Here I'm drawing on the work of Albert Hirschman, who I'm going to quote. Not even the 1952 election of Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower could turn the clock back. His administration affirmed a commitment to the welfare state, to the role of trade unions in industrial life, and to the slow movement towards racial equality embodied in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, and in the later acts to desegregate public schools. In the 1950s, it appeared that democracy could not only live with free market capitalism, but was essential to it. That a thriving capitalism could not only accommodate democracy, but required it. I pause here to note, and I do this just in passing, that the price of this compromise was paid in the coin of anti-communism, which served to restrain the spread of democratic ideas by insisting on sharply distancing them from socialism and communism in any form. Helman once again enters our story here, as she found herself clinging not to her old beliefs, which, like many others in that period, she abandoned, so much as in the right to believe as she wished. She rose above the question of her political beliefs with a resonant refusal to cooperate with investigatory committees that tried to chill the atmosphere, if you like, of the early 1950s. Her statement, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to this year's fashions," is by far the best known sentence she ever wrote, and one widely admired even by those who later declared she deployed the sentence to deflect accusations of communism. The Helman episode, which I'm not describing in detail to you here, suggests something of the nature of the 1950s compromise, the degree to which only a bounded egalitarian belief constrained within tightly defined perceptions of individual liberty had found a place in the American heart. If many Americans so feared socialism that they willingly suspended civil liberties in order to avoid it, Helman and her like-minded friends could not comprehend the ease with which they gave up hard-fought rights like free speech. The HUAC moment, the moment in which she uttered that sentence, Helman would say later, was when she first found out how very few liberals would stand firm against what they knew was an invasion of civil rights, a trampling on democratic ideals. That moment, in her view, struck a devastating blow against democracy. That, however, was not the common wisdom at the time. Writing at the end of the 50s, political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset summed up the prevailing mood. The ideological issues dividing left and right, he thought, had been reduced to a little more or less of government ownership and economic planning. Everyone could agree. A little later, a colleague put the issue more forcefully. In the Western world, he claimed, there is today a rough consensus among intellectuals on political issues. The acceptance of a welfare state, the desirability of decentralized power, a system of mixed economy, and of political pluralism. In that sense, the ideological age has ended. That's a quote from Daniel Bell, whose End of Ideology I thought some of you might recognize. As we now know, the ideological age hadn't ended. The struggle between socialism and capitalism might have passed, but the struggle within capitalism will continue. And its resurgence, the resurgence of that struggle came not from the left, but from the right. If the reciprocally supportive condition of capitalism and democracy had become a matter of common sense or conventional wisdom by the end of the 1950s, the larger dilemma embedded in the difficulties of reconciling a commitment to the public interest with the pursuit of private wealth remains salient. Their continuing alliance puzzled economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who, in the 1950s, confronted the issue. When he did so, he concluded that Americans held a false belief, that's his phrase, in the symbiotic relationship of capitalism and democracy, a belief captured in the slogan famously coined by auto executive Charles Wilson, "What's good for General Motors is good for the USA." That belief, thought Galbraith, enabled Americans to stare in the face of poverty without seeing it, to assume a responsive political apparatus without noticing its defects, to build what Eisenhower would call a military-industrial complex without acknowledging its political influence, to observe the democratic process fall into the grip of a moneyed elite without mourning the loss of public influence. Because economic and social phenomena are so forbidding, Galbraith wrote, individuals adhere to what they best understand. They acquire and become vested in a view of the world, cherished and esteemed because of its stability and acceptability, rather than questioning that view of the world. Their beliefs, true or false, were self-perpetuating, sustained by educational institutions, the media, public conversation. Power that's based on such belief, Galbraith would later write, is uniquely authoritarian. When fully effective, it excludes by its nature the thoughts that would weaken its grasp. For Galbraith, the central and, in his view, illusory belief, and the one that dominated the US in the latter half of the 20th century, was that, here I'm quoting, any public or private action that serves the purposes of the large business enterprise appears virtuous, and in that sense, appears to serve the purposes of the public. No real move towards a more egalitarian society could be achieved, he thought, in the presence of this false belief. In his words, the emancipation of belief is the most formidable of the tasks of reform, and the one on which all else depends. The difficulty of expanding democracy beyond the constraints of capitalism is perhaps best illustrated by the social movements of the 1960s, when a vibrant civil rights movement, a youth-generated New Left, an active assault on poverty, and an emerging women's movement all tried to increase participation in the polity. Individually and collectively, these activities ultimately ran afoul of the business-oriented spirit that John Kenneth Galbraith had identified. The authors of the Port Huron Statement, whose 50th anniversary we celebrate this year, and that's why I chose to quote them. Why not acknowledge that wonderful anniversary? Took pains to note the barriers built by anti-democratic belief systems. The system, in the words of the statement, produced a society, and here I'm quoting the statement, in which requirements of huge military, industrial, and political bureaucracies took precedence over all other social or individual priorities. They poisoned and corroded all aspects of intellectual activity. To them were sacrificed the essential ingredients of democratic process: free debate, the right to dissent, political engagement, and controversy. It shouldn't surprise us then that Helman fully supported those movements of the New Left, actions which some of you will recognize are contrary to the actions of most of the Old Left. A longtime supporter of racial justice, she engaged with Martin Luther King's 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom. She watched from the sidelines as students and the young protested the spirit of capital accumulation and the affluence of a consumer society by denuding themselves of goods and possessions. And though she laughed at their activities, she wrote in support of them and sometimes even acted in support of them. She contributed funds to anti-war activists who questioned government authority and its obeisance to business interests. She supported the campaign of Eugene McCarthy for president. And she applauded the liberal wing of a rising women's movement as it demanded access to elite professional schools and opportunity in the world of work. But the backlash was not long in coming. A sharp reassertion of free market prerogatives tied to the defense of liberty came even before the economic crisis of the 1970s fostered a reconsideration of government spending. We can date the emergence of the anti-egalitarian spirit to this moment, and with it, the breakdown of consensus in the belief that to maintain capitalism would require concessions to democracy. Abetted by fury against the violence that characterized demands for participation in the late 60s, by antagonism generated by the successful demands of women for cultural as well as economic change, and by a series of social and economic problems, including the rapid inflation that followed on the failure to pay for the war in Vietnam, rising unemployment, and sharply escalating oil prices, new forces of law and order sought to restrain the democratic impulse. Among the strategies were government reductions in spending for the social programs that had helped to expand social citizenship and equality in the 60s and before. With the egalitarian spirit stymied, the mid-century consensus broke down, leaving a vacuum quickly filled by advocates of an unrestrained free market. Capitalism ascended. Into that vacuum, and this is a story I think is familiar to most of us, came a new liberal, new neoliberal orthodoxy fostered by Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and his associates. Its emphasis on individual freedom, its highest goal to maximize individual liberty, even at the cost of the public good. The new orthodoxy placed its faith in the free play of untrammeled markets. In the new regime, big government became the enemy of the good, and markets the determinants of fairness and justice. Necessarily, this assertion of market fundamentalism posed a challenge to the social support systems that had underlined an expanding democracy, demonizing government spending for social welfare, systematically undermining trade union voices in their collective actions, and in general, shifting the role of government from that of equality's proponent to the vehicle of restraint. Helman was among the first to recognize the resurgence of a new politics that she called the politics of fear. In her view, efforts to deploy government as a weapon of restraint rather than a mechanism to encourage democratic participation grounded in shared and collective spirit seemed dangerous. She saw in these efforts the emergence of a new and insidious form of McCarthyism, whose secret operations and unhindered investigations would quickly chill the efforts of oppositional groups. In response, she called together a small group of friends who organized a committee for public justice to educate the public about the nature of the new surveillance state. The expanding committee, its membership, liberal, conservative, ex-communist, and anti-communist, operated through the decade of the 70s to expose the extent of government secrecy and its sometimes illegal operation. The FBI, the CIA, the grand jury system, all came under scrutiny. Each well-publicized investigation an effort to convince the public about its loss of freedom. The CPJ, incidentally, was one of the two agencies that sued the Nixon administration and made the Watergate tapes ultimately available. In the end, these activities in defense of democracy may have turned Helman into the target that she became at the end of her life. In a 1976 speech to Barnard College graduates, she urged them to stand up for themselves, for the values of community and responsibility in which she said they must march. The same year, at the start of the neoliberal ascendancy and reveling in celebrity, she published her most controversial memoir, Scoundrel Time. That book recalled her appearance before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, noting the fear that she experienced at the time. She held accountable not McCarthy and his minions, from whom she tells us she expected little else, but the liberal intellectuals of the time, the same intellectuals who had, by the 1970s, become identified with the new conservatism. She had, she tells us, expected that those intellectuals would speak up, lend their voices to protecting dissent, even if the dissenters espoused ideologies different from their own. Now, 25 years later, she named some of those who had not stepped forward, calling them cowards. She averred her right and that of others to believe as they would. That misstep, that call for democracy, would be all but fatal. She was roundly attacked, not merely taken to task, but rigorously accused of continuing to believe in a subversive form of equality, and worse, in the totalitarian state that pretended to defend it. Affixed with the label of Stalinism, she discovered herself accused of lying, her character assassinated, her work annihilated. Defenseless against the accusation, whose venom could be deflected only by admissions of sin that she would not make, she found herself caught in the conundrum that she had earlier identified. She claimed innocence of revolutionary intent and belief, but she could prove innocence only by denouncing her earlier beliefs, by rejecting the democratic value of free speech that she had upheld all of her life. Perhaps not every life serves as a metaphor for a century, but Helman's is too good a representation to ignore. Ultimately an advocate for and target of competing belief systems, she remained in the end true only to the notion that one was entitled to believe as one wished. By her rulebook, democracy required no less. If in the end she was defeated by the force of her own negative personality, by the tides of historical circumstance, as well as by rumor and invective, her life testifies to the continuing battle between the forces of a democracy rooted in egalitarian notions and the forces of a capitalism whose object is individual profit. There's no question that in 1984, when Helman died, she was on the losing side of a continuing tug of war that had by then tilted, and we have seen, as we have seen, would continue to tilt in favor of capitalism and to the detriment of democracy. In the quarter century since her death, the rise of a free market capitalism and the articulation of anti-government ideas have increasingly undermined the progress of equality and systematically eroded democratic rights. Perhaps things are changing now. A month or so ago, the New York Times began a long piece about the shifting belief in inequality with the banner headline, "Inequality Undermines Democracy." I cheered when I saw the headline. Somebody had made the connection. In 1952, the article told us 87% of Americans believed there was opportunity for progress up the income ladder. I held the belief system that John Galbraith identified as false. Only 8% in 1952 disagreed. It was the conventional wisdom. Today, 41% of Americans think there is no opportunity for upward mobility. The change in expectations in the conventional wisdom has brought with it the potential for disbelief. Once inequality becomes very acute, according to the author, it breeds resentment and political instability, ending the legitimacy of democratic institutions. The consequences, this from the Times piece, could be severe. Growing inequality, according to the piece, has bred a gap in political clout that has discouraged American faith in democracy. Yes, we who have studied the history of the 20th century might add, but the discouragement is likely to be temporary. As the current wave of challenges to the power of money suggests, we are now witnessing, we hope we are now witnessing, we may now be witnessing another shift in beliefs about the relationship of capitalism to democracy. One, I would argue, of several that have characterized this century and whose outcome will inform the debate in the decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, for that wonderful presidential address. Don't go away, we have something for you. On behalf of the 8,000 members of the Organization of American Historians, we want to give you this gavel as a token of our appreciation for your inspired leadership